to Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. Today's conversation promises to be an insightful one with a remarkable guest. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a regular listener, we're so glad you're here. Our goal is to bring you closer to the innovative leaders and thinkers shaping our future. And today I am thrilled to welcome Nicole Malachowski, a 2019 National Women's Hall of Fame inductee and former presidential appointee. Colonel Malachowski has over 21 years of experience as a military officer, leader, and fighter pilot in the United States Air Force. Upon her commission into the military, she was competitively selected to fly combat aircraft and embarked on an adventure among the first group of women to fly modern fighter jets. Nicole served as a mission-ready fighter pilot in 3 operational F-15E squadrons and accumulated over 2,300 flight hours, including 188 hours in combat. She has had the honor of commanding a fighter squadron, flying as an Air Force Thunderbird pilot, serving as a White House Fellow, and as an advisor to the First Lady of the United States. Nicole has forged a successful path through immense cultural changes in the military, as well as significant adversity in her personal life. Following her medical retirement from the Air Force due to the severe impacts of late-stage tick-borne illness, Nicole reinvented herself as a highly successful entrepreneur, professional speaker, and leadership consultant. She's been happily married to her husband, Paul, an Air Force veteran for over 23 years. When not hurriedly chasing their 15-year-old twins around, she finds immense meaning in traveling and advocating for those impacted by tick-borne illnesses. Well, welcome to Tipping Spears, Nicole.
It's a delight to be here. Thanks for having me, Hannah.
Yeah. Well, can you start us off by telling us where your story begins?
Well, I think my story begins a long time ago, 1979, 5 years old. I was a little kid that went to the local air show, right? When the air show comes to town, it's a big family event. It's a patriotic event. It's all over the news. And who doesn't love, some jet noise? And so I remember being that young is one of my earliest memories. And I saw the air show and the F-4 Phantom flew by, which many people know was the workhorse of the Vietnam War. And that was it. I was hooked, right? I covered my ears because it was loud. I could smell the jet fuel. I remember like my whole body rumbling, from the engine noise and just thinking, that's what I'm going to do someday. And that was kind of combined with the fact that I came from a family of service. Both of my grandfathers had served in the military. I was raised knowing that wearing our nation's uniform was honorable and noble and good. So when you put military service plus fighter jets together, it kind of equaled the Air Force. And so that's when I set my sights on it.
That's awesome. So was it just kind of the family legacy of military service that sparked your interest in going to the academy, or how did that come about?
Yeah, so I think once I became literally maniacally focused on becoming a fighter pilot, I started kind of doing my research. I wasn't the fancy athlete or any of that. I was definitely the nerd, in junior high and high school. And I realized, I needed to have a college degree and I needed a source of a commission. And I discovered that the Air Force Academy could provide, both of those things, as well as back then a higher shot of garnering a slot for pilot training. And so the Air Force Academy became a part, I guess, of that journey to reaching that target. But what was interesting was, in 1979, when I made this decision to be a fighter pilot, it's important to remember that women, it was against the law at the time for women to be fighter pilots, but a 5-year-old doesn't know that. And I remember being 12 years old, 1986, Top Gun came out. So this is now, right, reinforcing my young dream. And I remember going into my 6th grade class and announcing, that I was going to be a fighter pilot, and how that went over not so well with my teacher and not so well with my classmates. And I always tell people my career successes are not because I'm special by any stretch. It's all about TLC, timing, luck, and circumstance. I was born in the right country at the right time because the law, banning women from flying combat aircraft was lifted between my freshman and sophomore year at the Air Force Academy. So very lucky to have the opportunities. TLC, timing, luck, and circumstance plays into all of our lives, and it certainly impacted mine.
Oh, that's a great acronym. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to be the first female pilot selected for the Thunderbirds?
Yeah, I could probably spend an entire day talking about that, but I will tell you this. Going into it, I was actually blissfully naive. In fact, at the time that I made the decision to apply, I didn't realize that they hadn't had a woman Thunderbird pilot because it didn't even occur to me that it was an issue. Remember, I'd never known an Air Force without women fighter pilots in it, right? And the gentleman that I had the privilege of flying with didn't know either, right? They'd always served with women fighter pilots. So for me and my peers, it was kind of like, well, what's the big deal? So I applied and I got very lucky, to be selected. And I think that the second it was announced, that is when reality struck that for other people, this was going to be a very big issue. I became intimately familiar with SAF PA, or the Public Affairs Office there at the Pentagon. I went through a lot of additional media training. I think that's when it hit me, and I realized that this means something to a lot of other people, not just in the United States, but around the world. And it wasn't about me, right? It wasn't that they knew my name or cared about Nicole Malachowski. It was what it represented to them. And you can imagine that demographic, right? Looked a lot like young gals in middle school and in high school, sending letters, sending emails, all of those wonderful, very humbling things. And again, it wasn't about me. It's that this idea that, wow, if she can do something, then maybe I can achieve this too. So I will always tell people I felt a great weight to live up to that expectation and to be accountable and responsible to those young people's dreams. And I did my best to do that.
So do you have any advice, for women trailblazers that may be, the first woman or even, the only woman on a team or in the room? Kind of what advice would you give them as they kind of navigate that?
I start by saying that most people who are the first at something don't set out to be the first at something. I certainly didn't. It was kind of just an accident. I would suggest that, by following your dreams and your passions and working hard to try to become a master of your craft, you may accidentally make history, along the way. And for the people who are the first, men and women alike, across any industry or, any kind of activity, I think you have to remember the why you're doing it, right? It's in your heart. It's your dream. It's your passion. I didn't set out to become a fighter pilot or to become a Thunderbird to prove anything to anybody else. It was a goal of mine. And I like to remind people, that only you get to define success for yourself. Don't ever fall trap to letting any other team, organization, person define what that success looks like. So if it's something you want to do for your own personal reasons, go out and make it happen. And importantly, create that support structure, and nurture that support structure around you, because you're definitely going to need it.
So was there a particular event or person that served as, a catalyst for your career?
Yeah, I always tell people that the successes that I had are the result of a lot of hard work and attention by other people who invested in me. Again, I could probably spend all day naming names of just impactful people who were at those really critical turning points and junctures, in my career. When I think about the Thunderbirds, I think of General Goldfein, who had the courage to select me as the Air Warfare Center commander, and General Keyes at the time, who was at Air Combat Command, who provided the top cover to ensure that I was able to do my job. Those were two extraordinary men who I would not have been successful on the Thunderbirds, without them. But the single most important person to me is a lady by the name of Sue Ross. When I was 17 years old, I showed up at the Air Force Academy. My freshman year, she was my English teacher. And Sue Ross happened to be an Air Force captain at that time. So she too was young. But at 17, 18, I am staring at her like she hung the moon, because she was the first woman pilot I saw wearing pilot wings. She was a KC-135 pilot and part of the 80s ladies, that were early on at the Air Force Academy. She ended up taking me under her wing. She became my sponsor mom and helped guide me through my Air Force Academy years. She never had the opportunity to fly fighter aircraft, even though she graduated #1 at everything she did. So she nurtured my dream and supported the fact that I had these opportunities. When I failed check rides at pilot training, which I did, it was Sue Ross I called. When I was nervous trying to apply for the Thunderbirds, it was Sue Ross I called. When I took squadron command and I needed to create that first presentation of the squadron, right? That first impactful statement, it was Sue Ross I called. When I was bedridden for 2 years with a brain infection that ended my military career, Sue Ross. And just a few years ago, my family retired to Colorado and I moved 3 miles down the street from Sue Ross. And so I can tell you that all along the way, for my highs and my lows, she has been there as a mentor. And, people ask a lot, what should you find in a mentor? I said, you need someone who's going to cheer you on with your successes, someone who's going to pick you up during your failures. But I think the single most important thing is the third aspect, someone who will give you the attitude check that you need it when you need it. And Sue's always been that person for me.
She sounds like an awesome person.
Amazing. She's amazing. And, she went on to become a full bird colonel, wing command, KC-135, and she culminated her career as the speechwriter for the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Myers. And so when I started foraying into consulting and professional speaking, who helps me with my speech outlines? You got it, Sue Ross. So A+ to her. She has written some books. I'll give her a quick plug right now. She writes some candidate books for anybody who's looking to apply to go to any of the military academies. So if you're looking to apply to the Air Force Academy, look up Sue Ross's book. She gives you a lot of great advice for the young folks out there.
That sounds like a terrific resource.
She's a lot of fun. And I should say her husband, Dave, was there all along as well. He flew B-52s, and he's now my fly fishing instructor.
Oh, y'all just came full circle.
Right? They still can't believe that their sponsor daughter is in her 50s, but it's true. Time flies.
I love that. So Nicole, I know every journey, has its hurdles. That's just a reality, a part of life. What are some of the biggest obstacles that you faced in your career? And then how did you overcome them?
Yeah. I think when you look at my military, career, I often think that sometimes it's this idea of self-doubt that creeps in. I'm not going to Pollyanna cheerlead you here. I mean, being a woman flying fighters in the 90s, of course, there was some chauvinism that occurred. And I'm delighted to see that I saw that lesson and lesson all the way, across my career. We are not in a perfect place today. There is still progress to be made, but I'm delighted to say that there is progress, and it has been in the right direction. And we could tell those stories all day long, but they would be at the loss of the stories of all the great men, who supported me. Remember, there weren't a lot of women senior to me. So all of my instructors, my commanders, my supervisors, folks that wrote my OPRs, folks that gave me opportunities, were a lot of really, great men. So a lot of times it was the voice, of course, that was in my own head. And I'm going to tell you something that sometimes surprises people, but I really wasn't confident, and I didn't really think I was a good fighter pilot until after I finished my tour with the Thunderbirds. I had been a fighter pilot, right, in three operational squadrons before I even became a Thunderbird. I had flown in combat. I had all the certifications and qualifications like an instructor pilot, flight lead, mission commander. And even that, right, wasn't good enough, in my own mind. It wasn't until I was about a year removed from the Thunderbirds looking back going, well, yeah, maybe I am, kind of an okay pilot. And I think that as a 50-year-old woman raising children now, looking back on that, I always find that, really, really odd. Why is that? And the lesson I try to tell my kids is this: believe those who believe in you. You're never going to feel like you're 100% ready. You're never going to feel like you're the best, probably at anything. But when people invest in you and give you the opportunity to upgrade to flight lead, or they give you an opportunity to become a Thunderbird, or the opportunity to promote below the zone to a certain rank, there's a reason that they're doing that. They have a vested interest not only in your development, but a vested interest in the health of the organization. And you should take that as a compliment, and I think a sign of confidence, and I think try to internalize that. And I wish that was a gift I would have given to myself a little bit sooner in my career.
That's great insight, Nicole. I think that's something that people just, they're not, they don't really see that element to it.
It's amazing what becoming a mother will do when you look back on the lens of your own, weaknesses, mistakes, or errors, how we can look at that as a growth, really a growth experience. And so that's kind of like, it was in my own head, right? As far as like difficulties, but the second biggest difficulty, right, is going to be my transition out of the military. I'd been in 21 years active duty. I was, I had been below the zone. I was in '06. I was serving in the East Wing of the White House as an aide to Michelle Obama, and I fell severely ill out of nowhere, unexpected, unwelcome. I'd spend the next 2 years bedridden, spent 9 months unable to walk, talk, read, and write, did another year and a half in rehab. And during that time, right, I went through the medical evaluation board, and understandably and rightfully at the time, I lost my career. And trying to reinvent yourself and recover from that is wild. I mean, the most difficult time in my life. You go from this like elite performing, mentally fit, physically fit, spiritually fit, fighter pilot, to completely broken. And I mean, 100% dependent on other people for like all of my activities of daily living. And you sit there and a low spot. And I remember feeling sorry for myself, which I think is the right thing to do. And I think anybody would feel that way. And it's okay to be sad, and it's okay to cry, because I did a lot of that. Who am I if I'm not wearing my nation's uniform? What's my contribution to society if I'm not a fighter pilot? How am I going to provide for my family? I just lost my career and I live with complex chronic symptoms that don't allow me to have a normal job to get hired by anybody. Who's going to hire this? And so that whole kind of part of my life was probably the most difficult thing I and my family alongside of me went through.
No, that makes sense, Nicole. Just I remember, interestingly, how I found out about you over a decade ago was not your aviation career. It was actually my spouse was being medically retired out of the military. Totally unexpected. Everything you described, our life goes from him looking at his next command to now we live out of hospitals. And what just happened? It's like an ID went off in our life, right?
Yes,
And
ma'am.
everything you're describing, how do we provide? What is life? Your military career disrupted. Like this isn't falling on the timeline that was planned, and just all the impacts. And interestingly, that is how we found you, was finding out about your medical retirement. And I remember my husband was in the VA hospital at the time, and he found an article that you had interviewed or responded to about your experiences. And it was incredibly encouraging to us, because it was like, wow, look, she did it. This is not the end of the world. She's finding a way forward and impacting so many people. So I know that's just a little caveat, but I thought that was kind of interesting. And it was such a source of inspiration for us, and arguably one of the most difficult times of our life.
Yeah. No, well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. I think I got a little dust in my eye over here. Over here in my office, it's a little dusty. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry that you and your husband and family, had to endure the unexpected like that as well. And I'm truly humbled if I played a small part in giving you that little glimmer of hope that, life does go on, and that we really are all capable, I think, of reinventing ourselves. It's not easy. It certainly isn't. I used to think that like my legacy when I was the grandparent sitting on the porch, right, with my grandkids in the rocking chair was going to be, grandma was a fighter pilot and maybe grandma became a general, right? That was my goal, to become a flag officer. Obviously I didn't have the opportunity to compete for that. It would have been neat to see if I would have competed well. Um, but this legacy of the fighter pilot, and I realize now that actually life made me a fighter pilot to help me hone the skills and the traits and the characteristics that I needed to survive my illness, to rehabilitate during my illness, right? Focus, commitment, discipline, courage, grit, and to reinvent myself. And in fact, with my patient advocacy work that I do nowadays, I think I could make the argument that I impact more people now in a positive fashion, more quickly, and on a much grander scale than if I had ever stayed in the Air Force. So in a lot of ways, I'm exactly where I was meant to be. And that challenge of that illness and the hospitalizations and the things that you also experienced were part of forging the person that's standing here today.
That's such a beautiful description.
I love what I do with patient advocacy work because of the story that you just so graciously shared, right? Like we really all do have the power to change the world for other people, to impact people. And even if it's just one person, that is a ripple in the pond, right? That will spread and it will grow. And I think when we do kind things and positive things and helpful things, you can never really imagine, the actual positive end state, because it ripples far beyond you, far beyond time, far beyond anything you could measure.
So Nicole, I've heard you speak previously, and one thing that really resonated with me was the statement you made that sometimes you need to yield to overcome.
Yes, ma'am.
And that was one I was like, oh, let me replay that, because that wasn't where I was thinking. That one was where it was going. Can you share with us kind of what that means to you and how that can be applied to challenging circumstances?
Bet. I distinctly remember the day that those words came to my head. It was the 29th of December, 2017. And it probably seems weird that I can remember that detail, but that's how impactful those words were to my life. And so, why is that date important? That's the date that my military medical retirement came. I was actually home alone. To this day, I have never had a retirement ceremony, and nobody from the Air Force called that day. The level of abandonment and betrayal and the low point that I felt in that moment was stark. It was dark and it was extremely hurtful. In fact, they had mailed some of my retirement paperwork to me in a manila envelope. So for 2 years, I've been home alone, bedridden with a really cool home healthcare nurse. And then that was my retirement. It was hard. And I sat there and I was asking those questions, right? Who am I? What am I going to do? I can't really read or write very well. I have a lot of pain and fatigue. I can't work a normal 9 to 5 job. And it was all this negative. And clear as day, as I sat there, the words yield to overcome came to my mind. And what yield to overcome meant in that moment was stop asking or stop talking about the things you can't do, right? You're asking the wrong questions, Miss Fighter Pilot. Put your fighter pilot G suit back on and ask yourself the right question, which is, what can you do right now with what you have to move forward? And these aviation analogies were like in my head, right? Like this idea that the runway behind you is unusable, unless you're a helicopter pilot. But for a fighter pilot, the runway behind you is unusable. All I have is the runway that's in front of me. And yield to overcome actually came from a fighter pilot maneuver. And I'll use my hands here like fighter pilots do. When we come into a dogfight, we can come in head to head like this, 180 degrees out. It's called high aspect BFM. And you try to come to the merge with a lot of energy. And a lot of times when you get to that merge, that fight, right? This fight that I'm having for my life, this fight I'm having for my identity, you can pull too hard. And you can pull so hard that you bleed off all your energy and you start to fall out of the sky and the enemy can just own you. And so sometimes at this merge, once you've done the first kind of merge, you have to ease off on the stick. You have to yield, which is against your instincts when you're in the fight for your life. But it's what allows you to maintain your energy to sustain, to come back around and try again. And so it literally comes from high aspect BFM. That was yield to overcome is what was in my mind. And it was that attitude that allowed me to move forward. And I started doing research about people. I was bedridden, and I couldn't really read or write. So I would log on to college classes and listen to professors. I would go on YouTube. I was listening to TED Talks, listen to books on tape. And I came across a Japanese philosophy that resonated with me called Ikigai, Ikigai. And I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong. And I also am going to give a very simplified Western woman's version of a very deep, complex Japanese tradition. So I want to just put that respect out there. But it's basically Ikigai is finding your purpose in life. And I felt purposeless at that point.
Yeah.
So yielding to overcome. Ikigai says you need to find something you love, something you're good at, something you can get paid for, and something the world needs. And where those four circles overlap, that center, that's your Ikigai. And I was able to fill out those circles, 3 of them. The one I couldn't figure out, it just stopped me in my tracks day after day, was what am I good at? Because as a military person, I thought I'm a fighter pilot. What do fighter pilots do? I've only been a fighter pilot. I only know the military. I don't know what I'm good at. And I would answer, if anyone listening is struggling with that, ask the people who know you best, your family, your friends, the people you've worked with. Because all of a sudden they started throwing things at me that I hadn't even considered that were strengths of mine. And this is how I found my way into consulting and into public speaking. It's not the flying that I miss. What I miss is being a part of a team. And by being a consultant and a speaker, very selfishly, I am filling that hole in my heart by trying to help organizations and companies, find better ways to excellence and better ways to navigate change. So that's yield to overcome for me.
I love that description. It's like provides actionable framework for folks to take action on.
All credit to the Japanese culture there.
That's great. So you've done some incredible advocacy work for people with tick-borne illnesses. Can you tell us kind of how being engaged in advocacy has impacted you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, initially in those dark moments and those dark days, I had a lot of the poor me, which I think is an okay phase of grief for everybody to go through when something like this happens. It's part of the grief cycle. So I allowed myself to wallow in it for a little while, not forever. Why did I get bit by a tick? Could that have been prevented? Why did this happen to me? How come military medicine misdiagnosed me? How come it was allowed to get to late stages that have left me chronically ill? Why me? Why that? And I realized that that's not a good place to stay. And I knew that my kids were watching. You know, I was bedridden I have twins, between their ages of 5 and 7. They saw me laying in bed. And I knew it would be one thing for me to stay on the couch, you know, and maybe not do anything. But I had an opportunity to show them what resilience looked like, what, you know, resurgence looks like. And as a fighter pilot, I never flew a sortie that went the way I planned it. Not once, right? Not once. The enemy always has a vote. And life is that way too. And so I started just acting more like a fighter pilot, right? Which is, all right, how do you make sure that this doesn't happen to any other airmen out there? And I get really aggressive about it, right? Think about it. Like, what cohort of the American public is exposed to more global vectors than our service members and their military family members stationed around the world? Why is the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs not leading in this space? They should, and they have the capacity to, and I will continue to frustrate and challenge them until they get on board with what our advocacy community wants to do. What happened to me was preventable, and I will not sit here and watch any other airman, soldier, sailor, Marine, Coast Guardsman, right, endure what I went through. Because what happened to me was arguably preventable. And that's the part I'm not okay with. So why aren't we debriefing that as a Department of Defense? Why aren't we going, you know, first of all, if you can't get behind the ethical and the moral obligation to take care of people, right, which you would hope, can we not get behind the pragmatic view, which is, at the time I was medically retired, a 21-year experienced fighter pilot, we were 2,000 fighter pilots short of meeting our national security strategy. You don't just lateral in a 21-year experienced fighter pilots from some other company, right? You have to grow them from the ground up. It takes 21 years to create another me. I and other fighter pilots and every other career field out there are worth millions of dollars in taxpayer money. The taxpayers of America are not getting their return on their investment. And not a month has gone by in the last, what, 7.5 years that I've been retired, that I have not been mentoring somebody else in the military being medically retired for tick-borne illness. That is ridiculous, right? Because it becomes, in my eyes, a military readiness issue, and by nature, a national security issue. And this is something I challenge the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs on. Prevention, education, and awareness could take care of the vast majority of this, yet we are doing nothing. You can probably sense my frustration. I spent 10 years trying to get the Defense Health Agency to listen to me, to come on board with the national level, credible, science-based patient advocacy groups to do the May Lyme Disease Tick-Borne Illness Awareness Month. Let's just do education awareness, how to prevent a tick bite, how to safely remove a tick, and how to look for symptoms, just the basics. Chirp, crickets, I can't get through. Finally, this last year, I ran into a guy at a professional speaking engagement I had in my personal capacity, where I shared my tick-borne illness story. He came up to me afterwards. It ends up the guy is a full-bird colonel in the Army National Guard and happened to be the Wing Surgeon General of Missouri. So he's kind of cut from the same cloth as me. He's like, this is ridiculous. This is solvable. So we partnered with the national level nonprofits, and just this last May, in one day, we trained 100,000 National Guardsmen and Air Guardsmen and over 1,000 military medical providers. So my challenge to anybody from DoD or VA that is hearing this is, I now have proof of concept. The project's already done. I can hand it to you on a silver platter. Let's do this. Let's save lives and let's prevent disability together. Sound good?
That sounds like a winning plan.
So the advocacy work has given me purpose, and I'm a full bird colonel. I'll be darned if I leave anybody behind.
Yeah, no, that's so encouraging to hear. I know it's been frustrating for many years, but it's so encouraging to hear that y'all were able to make that impact, and good for you for being so, just tenacious and not giving up year after year after year of just nothing.
But look what popped up again, TLC, timing, luck, and circumstance. What were the chances that Dr. Colonel Russell Cole, hello, sir, want to give him a shout out, would be in the audience and have the courage and the grit and the intellectual skill as a medical provider, to partner with me? He didn't have to. He could have walked out of that conference and gotten a coffee, but he chose to do the right thing, and he deserves full credit.
Yeah, and y'all, saved lives, totally changed outcomes. So
awesome. It feels good, very selfishly. People say it's selfless what you do in patient advocacy work. I'm like, I don't know about that because a lot of it just feels really good. And maybe that's a little bit selfish, but why not?
There you go. So Nicole, what advice do you have for folks who find themselves, on the front lines of, a battle they did not choose, something they did not expect, such as, a major medical event, chronic illness, career not, disrupted or blown up, however you want to look at that. What advice do you have for folks that are kind of in that experience?
Yeah, I would definitely go back to the yield to overcome, mantra, and story. And I certainly recommend looking into Ikigai. But at the end of the day, I think that we have to learn as human beings to look at ourselves outside of our duty titles, outside of maybe the company, the uniform, right, that we wear. One of the things I like to teach people now, and I didn't do this prior to my illness, okay, so I don't want to act like, oh, I've been doing this all along. This was something I had to fall into deep, dark hole, to figure out. But, we need to know who we are. And I know that sounds super trite, but who are you outside of wearing your nation's uniform? Who are you outside of, being a Marine Corps sniper or whatever that looks like? We talk a lot in the military and a lot of companies as well in terms of values, right? In the Air Force, we have integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. And we buy into those, when we join these teams, rightfully so. Those are great values. But what are your values as a human being? Because I've found that the people who can answer that question clearly and confidently are the ones who are able to navigate hardship, challenges, change, the unexpected a lot smoother and a lot more efficiently. I'm not going to say it's ever going to be easy. So I had to really do some thinking when I was laying in bed. And believe me, I laid in bed for 2 years, so I had some time and I came up with my personal values. And these are aspirational, right? Because I'm a human being. So every day I wake up and I go through these 3 values in my head. And I try very hard to live my actions, decisions, and behaviors through those values. Make no mistake, I am not perfect. I don't always succeed. These are aspirational. But my 3 values are compassion, which I had to learn for myself during those dark times, which allowed me to be more compassionate to other people. It's going to be courage to do the hard things, to face the truth, right? You can't change it. So what are you going to do? And then the last one is curiosity. I find myself sometimes getting uncomfortable. I see somebody do something or make a choice, or I see something in the news and I'm like, I wouldn't do that. To me, that's always a red flag. You need to probably go ask some questions. You probably need to do some research, in some legitimate, credible places. Think critically for yourself. So I try to live by courage, compassion, and curiosity. And so for the people watching this podcast, I ask you, what are your personal values that you aspire to live by? Because if you can answer that confidently and you apply it daily, you will be able to handle the unexpected a lot more smoothly and efficiently.
I love the 3 C's there.
I didn't plan it that way, but that's just what I was forged into after going through that crucible experience.
Yeah. And you really hit the nail on the head. This podcast actually came about. It was I got very, very sick in my mid-30s in the middle of just the worst time. I was doing a fellowship with SOF. So that's like not the time to be sick when you're around a bunch of
physically unfit. Yeah.
Yeah, special forces people don't really get the whole bedridden thing.
Right.
So and and I struggled immensely with I had to take some time down. That was unavoidable. It's just like being T-boned with, something totally unexpected. And when you mentioned, kind of compassion on yourself, that was one of the kind of the most difficult things for me, because for me, it was like, my worth is my output, right? My worth is the additions to my resume, the projects getting completed. And it was actually a mentor of mine who encouraged me as I was still not very mobile and was pretty sick and spending a lot of time in hospitals. And he was like, well, you like talking to people and you need to, start baby stepping the way back to the things you love and the interests, and recommended starting a podcast. Of course, I knew nothing about podcasting. So I was like, all right, well, Google this.
But he saw your strength. See what I'm talking about? What am I good at? He saw it. And look at that. Look at you now.
Yeah. No, that's but the compassion for even just myself on the situation was one of the hardest components of kind of coming out of that low part, because that was something in 30 plus years I had never done before. I was never compassionate on myself. It's like, do more, push harder, right?
For others, keep putting everybody else first. I
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes being broken, to those lowest levels to kind of have, how do I put this? With these really severe illnesses and things that we go through, there's clarity. There is beauty in the clarity that comes from that pain. And that's exactly, what you're talking about. And I just want to say I'm sorry that you endured all of that. And I'm proud of you for walking the tunnel. You got to keep walking. There's light at the end. You may not be able to see it initially, but people, I don't know if people tell you this, do they ever go, Hannah, you're so resilient. I hear your story.
Yes.
And people say that to me and I say, thank you, but I love resiliency. I love that we're doing resiliency training. I love that
Mhm.
it's been highlighted more, especially across the military with regards to mental health. But Hannah, you and I aren't resilient, friend. We're beyond that, right? Resilience to me is like you make a mistake, a challenge, you fail a check ride. You say the wrong words to a loved one and have to apologize, but you have to bounce back the next day.
Mhm.
Resilience, you bounce back to your old self. But sometimes in life, some of us are chosen, who knows why, to go through a crucible experience like your illness and hospitalizations, right? That fundamentally change who you are,
I do.
fundamentally. And you're not resilient because you can't bounce back to your old self.
Mhm.
My old self prior to my illness does not exist anymore, right? That crucible experience forged us into something that was a stronger, better version of ourself. And so I like to tell people we're not resilient, Hannah. What you are is you're resurgent. And I think that word resurgent and resurgence, I think better captures the story that you just shared about your own challenges, and how you overcame them.
Oh, that's interesting. I've heard you kind of mention resurgence before, and like you, when people are like, "Oh, you're so resilient," it's just kind of like that. Oh, but I don't want to be resilient.
More than that,
I'm tired of being resilient.
People sometimes ask me because I look very healthy, but I live with a lot of, without getting into the world's tiniest violin here, I live with a lot of just daily complex chronic symptoms. And I always tell people I'm in pretty good shape for the shape that I'm in.
Yeah, that's a good response. I love the visual of bouncing back. That's a good visual. So Nicole, do you have any, final words of advice or, encouragement for folks that are listening today?
I think, we talked about yield to overcome and ikigai, believing those who believe in you, being resurgent. Final pieces of advice, I think I would say, no matter what you're going through, whatever that hardship is, you are not alone. You are not the first person that has experienced it. You will not be the last. So the real question is, how do you want to define yourself and your legacy through this? And you have a choice. So you're not alone. Reach out to others. Even if you can't get out of bed and physically be with somebody like me, you can find people. I love the beauty of the internet, online communities. Don't ever suffer in silence. There's somebody else out there you can talk to. So please reach out, don't suffer alone. And there is light at the end of the tunnel.
And where can the audience connect with you online? Do you have a website or social media, an account that you're really active on?
I do have a website. It's pretty, basic, NicoleMalachowski.com, but I tend to be active on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X. I have the same handle on all of them. It's at Real Malachowski, REAL Malachowski. There are faker accounts, which blows my mind. So please look for the validated, authenticated blue check marks. That'll be me. So at Real Malachowski, and I'd certainly be delighted to engage with anybody who's listened to this podcast and would like to continue the conversation more.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for coming on and sharing your experiences, your insights, your encouragement, your contributions to our nation, continue to impact so many.
Well, thank you kindly. Thanks for having this podcast, sharing people's stories. You're uplifting people more than you can imagine. So thanks for the opportunity.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of Tipping Spears. We hope this conversation has sparked new ideas and challenged the way you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and we'll catch you next time with another exciting guest.